following program is from NET, the National Educational Television Network.
The origins of man are shrouded in confusion and conflicting scientific opinions. The physiological background of Homo sapiens and when they appeared are still unanswered questions. Major anthropological finds during the past 20 years are providing new clues to solve these mysteries. To discuss them, here's Dr. William White Howells, Professor of Anthropology at Harvard University.
If I were to tell you that man appeared, let's say, 5,500,000 years ago, that he had a sort of reddish-brown skin when he appeared, and was covered with long, curly black hair, and that he appeared in Africa, I would frankly be talking through my hat. Now, any one of these things might be true, but the fact is we don't know. After all, the process of man's development must have been a slow and a gradual one. In fact, you can imagine that some early stage of man developed and, given 1 million years or so, spread itself widely through the tropics of the Old World, which would be natural. Then this would be followed by a further advance in human development, and this would be expected also to distribute itself widely through the Old World. However, you can imagine that the first early step would have taken place perhaps in Asia, and the second stage would have been arrived at in Africa. Now, if this is so, it's not realistic to suppose that a man originated simply in such and such a place once and at such and such a time. Well, let's start over again. Darwin and Huxley, 100 years ago, knew nothing about human evolution, excepting the fact that it had taken place. They were, after all, in the position of a man who knew that the earth was round but had never sailed around it. Darwin knew that our really close relatives were the anthropoid apes, and that we must have had a common ancestor with them. This, however, gave rise to the popular idea of a missing link, something halfway between a man and a chimpanzee. In fact, the German naturalist Haeckel even invented such a creature and named him Pithecanthropus ailalis, or speechless ape man. But this was a sort of momentary aberration on Haeckel's part, because he and Darwin and Huxley knew perfectly well that the real links were not of this kind, crosswise, but were rather common ancestors, the links of V-shaped coming to a common ancestor. There's one thing that you have to remember about this, and that is that the apes have been becoming more ape-like, that is to say, developing longer limbs, getting this exaggerated growth of the 4 teeth, for as long as we have been becoming man-like, although not necessarily at the same rate of speed. If Darwin and Huxley didn't know much about human evolution, and in fact had no evidence, the same is not true today. There is a great deal of evidence now, and it all falls satisfactorily into place. This is not to say that we have by any means a complete picture, or that there aren't very large gaps. Therefore, it's probably best to look in general at what we know and at what we don't know, instead of trying to give big, simple answers as to when or where man appeared. The actual fossil evidence for man's evolution all falls into the Pleistocene, or Ice Age. This is the period during which the climate fluctuated rather drastically from warm to cold about half a dozen times. And it's believed that this took place, that this occupied perhaps 1.5 million years, although the precise beginning of this is not too well known at the moment. However this may be, we have, during this period, quite a number of human fossils, some of them discovered as long ago as the last century, and therefore familiar to many people. Now here are a few of them, compared with the skull of a man of today, with his rather delicate, light face. This is a cast of the skull of Rhodesian man. His very heavy brow ridges, long, crude face. This is a cast of one of the Neanderthal men, also a rather low, heavy head and a long face. One of the many specimens of Neanderthal men known from all over the western part of the Old World, Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, even parts of Siberia. These two lived relatively recently as things go. They lived in the range of about 40 to 100,000 years ago. Now, in spite of the general crudity of their cranial architecture, the fact is that their brain sizes were approximately that of man of today. Things are different with the Pekin man. He not only lived much longer ago, on the order of 300,000 to 400,000 years, but his brain was also decidedly smaller than the others. These show the story of human evolution over the last 500,000 years has been essentially one of increase in brain size and a certain amount of lightening up of the skull. As far as we know, these men were the same size in body and the same shape in body as we are, so there are no missing links here. Men like the Pekin man, this earlier kind, and contemporaries of his, have been found in China and in Java and in North Africa and in East Africa. So they're quite a well-known stage of man. However, these finds don't take us far toward actual origins, and for a long time there was no idea of who the forerunners of these early men might be. In fact, the great advance in knowledge has fallen mostly into the last 20 years, and it consists of the discovery of a stage earlier still, before the brain had begun to increase in size at all. The discovery began, this stage lasted perhaps 1 million years, and the first discovery was made by Raymond Dart in 1924, when he announced the finding of the skull of a child, which he named Australopithecus. It's small and in many ways ape-like. I think you can see it better on a slide. Here in this slide, you see a lateral view of this skull. You can see that it's a rather ape-like looking little skull, although the important thing is the fact that his teeth are not large. If you look at these in the next slide, you will see that it has a round arch like man, that his teeth are large, but that they are squarish in pattern and have rather soft, round cusps, all of these being human traits rather than ape-like traits. This is what Dart brought to the attention of his colleagues. Now, Dart understood the significance of these finds, but it was some time before his colleagues understood it as well. After a number of years, a number of further finds were made in 5 cave deposits in South Africa. All of these showed the same general thing: small brains, large jaws, but with human traits showing in all of these parts. Mainly, however, there have been skeleton parts found, enough, so to speak, to make a whole one. And these show a number of characteristic traits which are definitely human. Let me show you on the skeletons of apes and man the sort of thing I mean. This means essentially a skeleton remodeled to walk upright on the ground. Here is the skeleton of a young orang. The foot has long toes and a short, opposable great toe, nothing in the way of an arch, and rather small legs, and a long pelvis. To compare that, the same thing in man, you see a foot without an opposable great toe, with a good, compact, strong arch, with long, heavy legs, a compacted pelvis, and a curve in the lower spine, which enables the top of the body to be held erect on the pelvis. Well, all of this taught a lesson which should have been realized probably before, and that is that man's, at this stage, was not something which was about 50% chimpanzee. Instead, here he was practically all ape in the brain and all ape and all human in the body. This, in turn, shows that the secret of man is not his brain so much as his gait. They change from the combination of shuffling on the ground and swinging in the trees, in the case of the apes, to well-established upright walking on the ground, which is the real characteristic of human beings. The Australopithecines are therefore a clear-cut stage of early man. They lasted, as far as we know, from about 1.5 million years ago to about 500,000 years ago. And since they've been found not only in South Africa, but in East Africa, other parts of Africa, in the Near East, and in the Far East as well, they evidently covered a wide territory in the Old World at this time in our history. They have also been called the man-apes for convenience, but this is not too good a term because it implies there was something ape-like about them. They are actually simply an early stage of man. They certainly had not been anything like an ape for some time. Their teeth show this. They are totally unlike those of apes, as I said before. Those of apes are expanded in the front of the mouth. They have large canines for fighting and defense, or for opening tough fruit, or both. This is such an important difference that I think we'd better look at some slides of this now. Here you see the upper jaw of one of the man-apes, in fact of Leakey's Zinjanthropus from East Africa. The particular characteristic of this are the very large back teeth and the very small front teeth and the round arch. For contrast now, look at the skull of a gorilla from the same view. On the right-hand side, you see his palate with a very long tooth row, large canine teeth, and expanded incisor teeth. In fact, 2 of them are missing, so he hasn't got the whole set. Next, please. Here is another view, a jaw of one of the large man-apes, looking down on it from the crown view. Again, the teeth make a nice rounded arch like man, totally unlike that of an ape. Compare that with the lower jaw of a gorilla seen from the same point of view, and you can see the meaning of the expansion of the teeth at the front of an ape's jaw. Take a side view of one of the mandibles of these larger man-apes. You can see that it's heavy, it's of the same bulk as a gorilla's jaw, but it's short and high and really quite vertical in front. Once again, take a view of a gorilla's jaw seen from an angle where the canine teeth interlock. This gives you a very good idea of the projection of the front of an ape's face with the large incisor teeth and the canines. Now, the teeth of Australopithecus were not exactly like ours, and the same is true of the skeleton. Nevertheless, they had made the grade, they had made the essential shift to ground walking, and this meant that their forelimbs, their hands, were completely free for the manipulation of food or tools or anything. Remember, of course, that the apes and the monkeys are already very good manipulators and also highly intelligent. Now let's look at a slide for a moment of a restoration of Australopithecus. This is an imaginary restoration by an artist, but based on the material, and it's probably as good a one as can be made. They're open country, ground-living animals. Now, this use of hands is undoubtedly the key to the increase of the brain, as tools came to be used more and more and eventually to be made more and more efficiently. Apes probably have all the brains they can use, but if you're a kind of a ground ape with no big canines for defense and not even claws on the hands to catch animals with or to use for defense, then stone tools become vital. And here is the secret of brains. It would seem that natural selection, Darwin's own great idea, would be the key, in that the more tools we used, the greater field there was for brains to use them expertly and to begin to develop intricate patterns for the making of tools. With this would come ideas of language and of society, and all of this would be an open field for natural selection to induce an increase in the size of brains. Now, one important point about the Australopithecines is that they were clearly divided into at least two kinds. One I've already shown you pictures of. He's known as Paranthropus. The teeth that I showed you slides of were actually those of Paranthropus. In these, the exaggeration of size was the greatest. And in these also, the face is the most massive, and the architecture for the accommodation of the jaws, of the jaw muscles, is the greatest. In fact, in this form, you also even get a small crest along the top of the brain case, like what is seen in a gorilla. We can see a little more of this by looking at some slides. Here is the original, the same specimen which you've seen the cast. You can see the massive architecture of the face, the large face, and this little broken crest, which serves simply to give attachment to very large muscles for the jaw. Here is a gorilla full face, in which this crest is very characteristic and simply signifies a very large lower jaw. Here is a view of this same specimen of Paranthropus, showing the crest and the same kind of a face, which does not mean that he is gorilla-like. Here is the other kind, which is known as Australopithecus proper. In these, the teeth were rather more like our own, and the cranium itself, the brain case, is of quite a different shape, perched higher above the jaw and the face. Here, finally, is one more of the Paranthropus variety. This is actually Leakey's Zinjanthropus from East Africa, which is the most extreme of this branch of the Australopithecines. It has the same crest along the top, the same massive facial architecture. Nevertheless, it belongs with the other apes, the man-apes from South Africa. The other branch of the Australopithecines is known as Australopithecus proper. These were smaller, apparently actually of pygmy size in the body. Their teeth were somewhat more like ours today, and there were signs that they were eating meat, although this is not something we can be certain of. There was a certain amount of confusion related to these names, Paranthropus, Australopithecus, and Zinjanthropus. They are all Australopithecines. They're all the same kind of animal. Nevertheless, there are these anatomical distinctions, and there is the suspicion that Paranthropus was a big vegetarian and that Australopithecus was a little meat-eater. It also seems likely that it was Australopithecus that eventually gave rise to later kinds of man and to ourselves. And also there are signs that Paranthropus lingered on longer in the deposits and in fact overlapped with later kinds of man. The situation is something like this. If this represents the whole ice age, and this the long lower part, about 1 million years, Then you have the Australopithecines appearing from an unknown past, dividing into two branches, one of which was Australopithecus, the other Paranthropus, somewhat different. Australopithecus eventually, either directly or in another side branch, giving rise to Homo or later forms of man, who eventually split up toward the present day. Paranthropus continuing longer as a different kind of animal, but becoming extinct. Well, that's quite a lot of information about our ancestors at this Australopithecine stage in the lower Pleistocene. But the question is, what happens to the lower end of the line when it goes back into the Pliocene? The answer is, no man-apes have been found there. There are fossils, all right, but they are fossils of pongids. That is to say, they're ancestral to the living apes and can be distinguished as such. The pongids and the hominids must have made two separate lines at some time. Darwin himself realized that at some point the hominid line must have diverged and led in the direction of man, namely the direction of the Australopithecines. But we have practically no evidence of this. We have just one fragment, one fragmentary piece of evidence. A fossil jaw was found in India in 1915 of Pliocene date. It was named Ramapithecus because it was assigned to the pongids, but at the same time it was noted that it had a short face and rather hominid teeth. For years, people noted the hominid features of this trait, of this fragment, but it wasn't until 1961 that Dr. Leakey in Africa found another fossil fragment very much like this, which he named Keniopithecus. A slide will show how very fragmentary this is. It has only a couple of teeth, and it has a sort of a loose canine, but it's quite possible to see the canine tooth is short, and also it can be seen where the cheekbone fits into the jaw, showing that the face was short. Now, the features of Ramapithecus are very similar to this, and in fact, this fragment, small as it is, can be reconstructed in only one way. We can look at this, which shows us a palate with teeth of a hominid nature, rather squarish, and a round palate with a short face. Now, this has been studied intensively lately by Dr. Simons at Yale, who is satisfied that this and a few other fragments he has found in old collections are really of a hominid creature and not pongid at all. We therefore have a sort of near ape which nevertheless has distinct hominid features. So much so that it shows that at the time it existed, the split from the pongids had already occurred. Now, the date of all these fragments is the early Pliocene, about 15 million years ago. Since this represents the time when the apes and man had actually become separated, we know that human history goes back at least that far. At the moment, that's all we can say. But give us another 100 years. Well, where does this leave us today? Still looking, obviously. There's plenty to search for in all three of the great periods of man's history about which we know something now. I said, of course, that we have many fossils found in the last century of recent fossil men, that is from the later Pleistocene. Not a year goes by but what another Neanderthal man or so comes to light. Just in the last year or so, the first one was found in Greece, and the first one was found in Morocco. In spite of this, we still do not know how we are related to Neanderthal man. Strangely enough, some of the Neanderthals come from a fairly late date, about 40,000 BC, and some of the men of our own kind go back to about the same time. What we would like to know is whether they overlapped or not. As the search goes on, not only do Neanderthal men come to light, so do men of our own kind. Only a few years ago, a skull of modern type was found deep in a cave in northern Borneo, about as inaccessible place as you could find. This had a date of about 40,000 BC. Well, this is the story of the later Pleistocene. Many kinds of fossil men, but still quite badly connected. They're badly off for a family tree. We not only cannot relate ourselves to the Neanderthal men, But we can't relate either us or the Neanderthals to such a form as Pekin man. And here we are back near the lower Pleistocene. When we get here, we have these excellent finds from South Africa, demonstrate the fact that man was now, or rather man at this stage, was an erect, ground-walking form. But in spite of this, we still do not know whether the Australopithecines were making tools. Tools occur in some of the deposits. This seems to indicate that Australopithecus was making or using them. Unfortunately, there is pretty good sign that there was an overlap with the later kinds of men, rather like Pekin man, coming along, and so they are candidates for having made these tools. Nevertheless, this is the sort of material which is being looked for not only in South Africa and East Africa, but in other likely parts of the world. One of the most likely would be this critical point at the late Pliocene. Now there are beds in India all through the Pliocene, which might give us types of humanity or near humanity which were just prior to the Australopithecines, going back toward Ramapithecus. The deposits are large. Fossils wash out of them. What is needed is somebody to go and sit and try to pick up the fossils. Furthermore, the deposits in a place like India are not the only places to look. Professor Simons has even looked in museum collections. This is where he found some unrecognized fragments to be assigned to Ramapithecus. So a little of this can be done as well. Nevertheless, we have this long period of the Pliocene, which might very fruitfully yield more fragments of humanity before Australopithecus. At the moment, all we have is these few fragments of Ramapithecus, this striking hominid, if that's what he is, down at the bottom of the Pliocene, signaling that, in fact, by this time, some 15 million years ago, there had occurred this branching off of a form which had made the first steps toward becoming man.
Is NET, the National Educational Television Network.